Santos looked at her remaining ammunition and felt a cold realization settle over her. She had exactly 6 bullets left in her grandfather's pistol, with no spare magazines remaining. Around her, at least 30 rebel fighters were closing in from all directions, their weapons ready and their confidence high after hours of fierce fighting. Her team was in desperate condition. Sergeant Rodriguez was losing blood from his shoulder wound, though he still gripped his empty rifle with determination. Lieutenant Zhang had sustained injuries during the hand-to-hand combat but remained alert and ready to fight. Corporal Kim was nearly out of medical supplies, having used most of her equipment treating wounded team members. Private Johnson sat propped against a rock, his leg injured but his eyes still scanning for threats. The rebel forces had learned to respect Santos' marksmanship during the battle, and they were no longer advancing recklessly. Instead, they moved with careful coordination, using covering fire and tactical movement to minimize their exposure. Santos could see rebel commanders positioning their forces for a final assault that would overwhelm the government team's position through sheer numbers. But Santos had noticed something during the fighting that gave her a desperate idea. The rebel forces were being coordinated by 6 key leaders positioned at different points around the encirclement. Each leader controlled a specific sector of the attack, communicating through hand signals and radio communications to maintain tactical coordination. These 6 commanders were the brain of the enemy operation. If Santos could eliminate all of them simultaneously, the rebel forces would lose their coordination and might retreat into confusion. It was an impossible shot sequence that would require perfect accuracy under extreme pressure, but it was the only chance her team had for survival. Santos studied each target carefully, calculating distances and angles. The closest commander was about 40 meters away, partially concealed behind a fallen tree. The farthest was nearly 80 meters distant, positioned on a rocky outcrop that provided an excellent view of the entire battlefield. The other 4 leaders were scattered at various positions around the encirclement. The technical challenges were enormous. Santos would need to engage 6 targets at different ranges and elevations within a matter of seconds, giving the enemy no time to react or take cover. Each shot would need to be instantly fatal, because wounded commanders could still coordinate their forces effectively. There would be no opportunity for second chances or corrective fire. Even more challenging was the ammunition limitation. 6 bullets for 6 targets meant perfect accuracy was not just preferred but absolutely essential. A single miss would mean certain death for Santos and her entire team, because the rebels would immediately return overwhelming fire once they realized what was happening. Santos took a deep breath and entered what combat veterans call the zone, a state of heightened awareness where time seems to slow down and every detail becomes crystal clear. She could feel her heartbeat steady, her breathing become controlled and rhythmic. The chaos of battle around her faded into background noise as her focus narrowed to the 6 targets she needed to eliminate. The first target was the easiest shot, the commander behind the fallen tree who was only 40 meters away and partially exposed. Santos raised her pistol with both hands, aligned the sights, and squeezed the trigger with perfect smoothness. The bullet struck the rebel leader center mass, dropping him instantly. Before the other commanders could react to the sound of gunfire, Santos was already shifting to her second target. This leader was positioned 60 meters away behind some large rocks, but he had made the mistake of exposing his head and shoulders while observing the government team's position. Santos put her second bullet through his forehead with surgical precision. The third target had heard the gunshots and was beginning to take cover, but Santos was already tracking him through her sights. As he dove behind a boulder, she fired her third bullet at the exact spot where his chest would be when he completed his movement. The timing was perfect. Bullet and target arrived at the same location simultaneously. By now the remaining rebel commanders realized they were under attack from an incredibly skilled marksman, and they began moving erratically to avoid becoming targets. But Santos had anticipated this reaction and was already lined up on her fourth target. As the commander tried to sprint from one position to another, Santos led him perfectly and fired. Her fourth bullet caught him in mid-stride, sending him tumbling down the rocky slope. The fifth target was the most challenging shot of the sequence. This commander was positioned on high ground nearly 70 meters away and was now moving rapidly while shouting orders to his confused troops. Santos had to calculate his movement speed and trajectory while accounting for the elevation difference and distance. Her fifth bullet traveled in a perfect arc that intercepted the running figure just as he reached what he thought was safety behind a large boulder. One bullet remained, and one target. The final rebel commander was positioned on the rocky outcrop 80 meters away, the farthest and most difficult shot of the entire sequence. He had witnessed the elimination of his fellow leaders and was now crouched low, using the terrain to minimize his exposure while trying to maintain control of his increasingly confused forces. Santos knew this final shot had to be perfect. The rebel forces were already beginning to lose cohesion as they realized their leadership structure was collapsing, but they still vastly outnumbered the government team. If the surviving commander could rally his troops for one final assault, Santos and her team would still be overwhelmed by superior numbers. The distance was at the extreme range of pistol accuracy, and the target was presenting only a minimal silhouette behind cover. Santos would need to wait for the perfect moment when the commander exposed enough of himself to provide a viable target. But waiting too long would allow the rebel forces to reorganize under new leadership. Santos steadied her pistol and controlled her breathing, waiting for the target to make a mistake. Through her sights, she could see the rebel commander cautiously raising his head to assess the situation. For just a moment, he exposed his profile as he turned to shout orders to his scattered forces. Santos took the shot. The bullet traveled across 80 meters of mountain air and struck the rebel commander in the temple, ending his life instantly. The precision of the shot was so perfect that soldiers on both sides of the battle stopped fighting for a moment, stunned by what they had witnessed. With all 6 commanders eliminated, the rebel forces lost all tactical coordination. Individual soldiers and small groups began retreating toward safer positions, unsure of what they were supposed to do without leadership. The carefully planned encirclement dissolved into chaos as different units received conflicting orders or no orders at all. Santos lowered her empty pistol and surveyed the battlefield. Her impossible gamble had worked. 6 perfect shots had turned certain defeat into unexpected victory. But she knew the situation was still precarious. While the immediate threat had been neutralized, larger rebel forces would soon arrive to investigate the silence from this position. "We need to move now," Santos told her team. "They'll send reinforcements once they realize what happened here." Despite their injuries, Santos' soldiers moved with renewed energy born from hope. They had witnessed something extraordinary. Their general had single-handedly eliminated 6 enemy commanders with 6 consecutive perfect shots under impossible conditions. It was the kind of marksmanship that would become legend among military circles. The team began their withdrawal, using the confusion among rebel forces to slip through positions that had been heavily defended just minutes earlier. Santos led them along a route she had memorized during their initial reconnaissance, moving carefully but steadily toward the extraction point. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Santos could hear the sounds of rebel forces regrouping in the valley below. New commanders were taking control and attempting to reorganize the scattered troops, but the psychological impact of losing their entire leadership structure would take time to overcome. 3 hours later, Santos and her team reached the emergency extraction point where a helicopter was waiting. As they lifted off into the dawn sky, Santos looked down at the battlefield where she had made 6 impossible shots that saved her team's lives. The intelligence gathered during their mission proved invaluable for future operations against rebel forces. But the story that spread through military ranks was not about intelligence gathering. It was about a general who faced impossible odds with 6 bullets and emerged victorious through skill, courage, and perfect marksmanship. Years later, when military historians analyzed the battle, they concluded that Santos' achievement ranked among the greatest individual combat performances in modern warfare. 6 targets, 6 bullets, 6 perfect shots under extreme pressure with her team's lives hanging in the balance. Santos never spoke publicly about that day, considering it simply her duty as a soldier and commander. But her grandfather's pistol, the weapon that fired those 6 perfect shots, was eventually retired to a place of honor in the military museum, where it stands as a testament to the power of skill, determination, and courage under fire. The rebellion in the Cordova Mountains was eventually defeated, but soldiers who served in that conflict still tell stories about the general who was surrounded by enemies and made 6 perfect shots that changed the course of battle. For those who understand combat shooting, Santos' achievement represents the absolute pinnacle of marksmanship under pressure, a feat that combined technical skill with incredible mental toughness and tactical brilliance. In the end, Santos proved that sometimes a single soldier with exceptional skill and unshakable determination can overcome impossible odds. Her 6 perfect shots became legend not because they were lucky, but because they represented the culmination of years of dedicated practice and absolute commitment to protecting her team at any cost. The first shot came from a rebel sniper positioned high in a tree about 200 meters away. The bullet struck the rock inches from Santos' head, sending stone fragments flying. Her team immediately returned fire, but Santos held back, studying the enemy positions and calculating angles. She had learned long ago that in desperate situations, every bullet needed to count. Wild shooting might provide psychological comfort, but it wasted ammunition and revealed your position without achieving tactical advantage. Santos watched and waited, identifying the most dangerous threats among the advancing rebels. The enemy sniper fired again, this time targeting Sergeant Rodriguez, who was trying to establish radio contact from behind a fallen log. Santos saw the muzzle flash from the tree and instantly calculated distance, wind speed, and target movement. In one fluid motion, she raised her rifle and fired. The rebel sniper tumbled from his perch, his weapon clattering down through the branches. The other rebels immediately focused their attention on Santos' position, recognizing her as the primary threat. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions, filling the air with the deadly buzz of bullets passing overhead. Santos rolled to a new position behind a different boulder as enemy fire concentrated on her previous location. Chips of stone flew everywhere as high-powered rounds struck the rocks around her. She counted muzzle flashes and identified at least 8 different firing positions in the treeline below. Lieutenant Jean was pinned down behind a small outcropping, unable to move without exposing himself to enemy fire. Private Johnson had found cover behind some fallen logs, but rebels were flanking his position from the left. Corporal Kim was treating a wounded soldier while simultaneously returning fire with her sidearm. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Santos realized that conventional defensive tactics wouldn't work against such overwhelming numbers. The rebels could afford to keep her team pinned down while additional forces moved into flanking positions. Soon they would be surrounded completely, with no possibility of escape. That's when Santos made a decision that would either save her team or get them all killed immediately. Instead of remaining in defensive positions, she stood up and charged directly toward the advancing enemy line. The rebels were so surprised by this apparent suicide attack that their fire actually slackened for a moment. Santos used that brief hesitation to sprint toward a large tree that would provide cover closer to enemy positions. Bullets whined past her as she ran, but her sudden movement had disrupted the rebels' carefully planned assault. From her new position, Santos had a clear view of several enemy fighters who thought they were safely concealed behind rocks and vegetation. She began picking them off with precise rifle shots, each bullet finding its target despite the chaos of battle raging around her. The first rebel she targeted was a machine gunner who had been laying down devastating fire on her team's position. Santos put a single round through his chest, and the heavy weapon fell silent. The second target was a squad leader who was coordinating the flanking movement against Private Johnson. Another perfect shot eliminated that threat. But Santos knew she couldn't maintain this aggressive position indefinitely. Enemy fighters were already moving to surround her new location, and her rifle ammunition was running dangerously low. She needed to get back to her team before the rebels cut off her retreat route completely. As she prepared to move, Santos heard the distinctive whistle of an incoming grenade. Someone had managed to get close enough to throw explosives into her position. She dove away from the tree just as the grenade detonated, filling the air with deadly metal fragments and smoke. The explosion left Santos temporarily deafened and disoriented, but she forced herself to keep moving. Rebel soldiers were advancing through the smoke, confident that their grenade had eliminated the troublesome sniper. Santos could see their shapes moving through the haze as they approached what they thought was her body. Instead of retreating, Santos decided on another desperate gamble. She dropped her nearly empty rifle and drew her grandfather's pistol, then moved toward the advancing rebels instead of away from them. The smoke provided excellent concealment, and the enemy fighters weren't expecting her to attack when she should have been wounded or dead. The first rebel soldier emerged from the smoke less than 10 feet away, his rifle raised and ready. Santos put 2 quick shots center mass, dropping him instantly. The second fighter appeared a moment later, confused by the sound of gunfire from what should have been an empty position. Santos eliminated him with a single shot to the head. But her aggressive tactics had a cost. While she was dealing with the immediate threats in the smoke, other rebel forces had used the distraction to advance on her team's main defensive position. Santos could hear intense gunfire from where she had left her soldiers, indicating they were under severe pressure. Santos emerged from the smoke to see a scene that made her blood run cold. Rebel fighters had reached her team's position and were engaged in close-quarters combat with her remaining soldiers. Sergeant Rodriguez was down, clutching his shoulder where blood seeped through his fingers. Lieutenant Zhang was fighting hand-to-hand with a rebel soldier twice his size. The tactical situation had become completely fluid, with friend and foe intermixed in a chaotic melee that made precision shooting nearly impossible. Santos couldn't fire without risking hitting her own people, but she couldn't stand by while her team was overwhelmed by superior numbers. She made another split-second decision that went against every principle of military tactics. Instead of trying to find a good shooting position, Santos holstered her pistol and drew her combat knife, then charged into the middle of the fight. Her sudden appearance behind enemy lines created massive confusion among the rebel forces. Soldiers who thought they had the government team defeated suddenly found themselves fighting on two fronts. Santos moved through the melee like a force of nature, using her knife with deadly precision while her team rallied around her unexpected arrival. The tide of battle began to shift, but Santos knew it was only temporary. More rebel reinforcements were already climbing toward their position, and her team was running critically low on ammunition. They had maybe 5 minutes before being completely overrun by fresh enemy forces. That's when Santos noticed something that would change everything. During the chaos of close combat, several rebel soldiers had dropped their weapons and equipment. Among the scattered gear was a radio that appeared to be working, its antenna still extended and status lights blinking. Santos fought her way toward the radio while her team provided covering fire. If she could contact rebel headquarters and convince them she was one of their own commanders, she might be able to call off the attack long enough for her team to escape. It was an incredibly risky plan that required perfect timing and flawless execution, but it was their only chance. She reached the radio just as another wave of rebel reinforcements appeared at the bottom of the slope, moving rapidly toward their position. Santos grabbed the radio and began speaking in the local dialect, hoping her accent wouldn't give her away. She claimed to be a rebel commander who needed immediate evacuation due to government airstrikes in the area. The response was immediate and confused. Multiple rebel units began talking over each other on the radio frequency, asking for clarification and reporting contradictory information. Santos realized she had stumbled into a communication breakdown that could work to her advantage. But even as she tried to manipulate the enemy communications, Santos could see that her deception wouldn't last long. Some of the approaching rebels had witnessed the fighting and would soon report that government forces were still active in the area. She had maybe 2 minutes before her ruse was discovered. Santos made hand signals to her team, indicating they needed to prepare for immediate withdrawal. But, as she looked around their position, she realized escape was impossible. Rebel forces now surrounded them completely, with steep cliffs blocking the only remaining direction. They were trapped with no ammunition, no communications, and no hope of rescue. The final phase of the battle was about to begin, and Santos knew it would require everything she had learned about combat shooting over her entire military career. General Maria Santos had always been different from other military officers. While her colleagues spent their free time in officers' clubs discussing strategy over whiskey, she could be found at the shooting range, practicing with various firearms until her hands ached and her eyes burned from concentration. Her fellow soldiers often joked that she could hit a fly from 50 meters, but they had no idea how close to the truth they were. The rebellion in the mountain region of Cordova had been brewing for months. What started as peaceful protests against government policies had escalated into full-scale warfare. Rebel groups had taken control of several key positions in the mountainous terrain, using the natural landscape to their advantage. The government forces found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to know every cave, every hidden path, and every strategic position better than they did. General Santos was assigned to lead a special reconnaissance mission deep into rebel territory. Her orders were clear but dangerous: gather intelligence on rebel positions and report back to headquarters. The mission required a small, elite team that could move quickly and quietly through enemy lines. Santos handpicked 12 of her most trusted soldiers, men and women who had served under her command for years and understood her methods. The team included Sergeant Rodriguez, a communications expert who had saved Santos' life twice in previous missions. There was Corporal Kim, a medic whose quick thinking had kept countless soldiers alive during fierce battles. Private Johnson brought his expertise in explosives and demolition, while Lieutenant Zhang served as the team's navigator, capable of finding his way through any terrain without a compass. As they prepared for the mission, Santos checked and rechecked her equipment. She carried her standard-issue rifle, but also brought her personal sidearm, a custom pistol that had belonged to her grandfather, who had fought in 3 different wars. The weapon had been modified over the years, its grip worn smooth from decades of use, its sights adjusted to perfection. Santos knew every scratch on its surface, every slight imperfection that actually made it shoot straighter. The helicopter dropped them at the edge of rebel territory just before dawn. The plan was simple: move through the mountains, observe rebel positions, and reach the extraction point within 72 hours. Intelligence reports suggested the area was lightly guarded, with most rebel forces concentrated further north where the main battle was taking place. For the first day, everything went according to plan. The team moved silently through dense forest, using established trails that locals had abandoned when fighting began. They encountered no resistance, spotted no enemy patrols, and made excellent time toward their objective. Santos began to feel optimistic about the mission's success. On the second day, they reached a ridge that overlooked the main rebel encampment. Through binoculars, Santos could see hundreds of enemy fighters, supply trucks, and artillery pieces positioned throughout the valley below. She made detailed notes about troop movements, equipment locations, and defensive positions while her communications officer attempted to establish contact with headquarters. That's when everything went wrong. Sergeant Rodriguez whispered urgently into his radio, trying different frequencies and adjusting the antenna, but received only static in response. The mountains were interfering with their communications equipment more than anticipated. Without radio contact, they couldn't call for extraction or report their findings to command. Santos made the difficult decision to move to higher ground, hoping to find a position where their radio would work. The team began climbing toward a peak that rose another 1,000 feet above their current position. The terrain was treacherous, with loose rocks and steep drops that forced them to move slowly and carefully. They were halfway to the summit when Private Johnson spotted movement in the forest below. Through his scope, he could see rebel patrols moving systematically through the trees, clearly searching for something. The enemy had discovered their presence and was now actively hunting them. Santos realized they had walked into a trap. Intelligence reports had been wrong. The rebels weren't concentrating their forces in the north. Instead, they had been waiting for exactly this type of reconnaissance mission. The lightly guarded area had been bait, designed to draw government forces into an ambush. The situation deteriorated rapidly. More rebel units appeared from different directions, moving to surround the government team's position. Santos counted at least 60 enemy fighters closing in from three sides, with only a steep cliff face behind them offering any protection. The rebels moved with precision and coordination that spoke of extensive military training. Lieutenant Zhang studied his map frantically, looking for escape routes, but found none that didn't lead directly into enemy positions. The rebels had chosen their trap well, using the natural terrain to force the government team into an impossible situation. Santos gathered her soldiers in a small depression behind some large boulders that offered minimal cover from enemy fire. She could see the determination in their faces, mixed with the fear that comes from knowing you're outnumbered and outgunned. These were experienced soldiers who had faced death before, but never in circumstances quite this hopeless. "We have two choices," Santos told her team quietly. "We can surrender and hope they treat us as prisoners of war, or we can fight our way out and probably die trying." Sergeant Rodriguez checked his ammunition count and shook his head grimly. "Ma'am, with respect, those aren't really choices. Intel says these rebels don't take prisoners, especially not government officers." Santos nodded, knowing he was right. Reports from other missions indicated that rebel forces had executed captured government soldiers rather than deal with the logistics of keeping prisoners. Surrender would likely mean death, just death without the dignity of fighting back. Corporal Kim finished treating a minor injury that Private Johnson had sustained during their climb and looked up at Santos with resolve in her eyes. "General, we've followed you through worse situations than this. If we're going down, we go down fighting." The sound of approaching voices grew louder as rebel forces closed in on their position. Santos could hear commands being shouted in the local dialect, coordinating the final assault on their makeshift defensive position. Enemy soldiers were moving carefully but steadily up the mountainside, using rocks and trees for cover as they advanced. Santos checked her weapons one final time. Her rifle held 30 rounds, and she had 2 spare magazines. Her pistol contained 8 bullets, with 2 additional clips attached to her belt. 46 bullets total to face 60 enemy fighters who held every tactical advantage. But, as she gripped her grandfather's pistol, Santos felt a strange calm settle over her. She remembered the countless hours she had spent on shooting ranges, the endless practice sessions that other officers had mocked as obsessive. She thought about her grandfather's stories of impossible battles where skill and determination had overcome overwhelming odds. The rebels were close enough now that she could see individual faces through gaps in the rocks. Young men and women, some barely out of their teens, all carrying weapons and moving with the confidence of fighters who knew victory was assured. They had no idea that they were about to face a marksman whose abilities bordered on legendary. Santos took a deep breath and prepared for the fight of her life.